Irene Garza, a young teacher and beauty queen, vanished in McAllen, Texas, and her case was unsolved for decades. This case involves the over 50-year-long unsolved death of a young teacher and beauty queen. Criminals involved typically have good cover for their actions. However, in this instance, the problem should have been fixed considerably sooner than it was. What actually happened? And how did the murderer manage to escape justice for such a long time? Irene Garza was born in 1934 to prominent McAllen, Texas dry cleaning entrepreneurs. Irene went to McAllen High School. Due to the family's business success, they were able to relocate to a more affluent area of the city. Irene was one of the school's few Latin students, and she was also very well liked by her classmates. Following her studies, her stunning beauty led her to becoming a beauty queen. In 1958, she was crowned Miss All South Texas Sweetheart and served as Pan American College's homecoming queen. Despite being just in her 20s, Irene became a teacher and served as the Parent-Teacher Association secretary, demonstrating how highly regarded she was in the community. Irene was a devoted Catholic who regularly went to Mass and received communion. She left for a confession at the Sacred Heart Church on Saturday, April 16, 1960, but never returned. Unwisely, her parents allowed time to pass while thinking their daughter was waiting at the church for midnight mass. They naturally grew more apprehensive once the time passed 3 a.m. and decided to call the police. The hunt continued, and on April the 18th, 2 days later, a roadside was filled with many of Irene's belongings. With more than 500 people interrogated and more than 50 polygraph tests conducted, the search for evidence was one of the biggest ever conducted in the area. Additionally, a sizable reward was offered for information on the disappearance. The police encountered many problems, including bogus callers posing as Irene, claiming she had been abducted. Additionally, a caller in a bar claimed to have killed the young teacher. Given that erroneous convictions are not unheard of, it is hard to understand why someone would choose to do this and risk spending the rest of their life in prison. Sadly, on April the 21st, Irene's lifeless body was discovered in a neighboring canal. She had been assaulted, battered, and strangled to death. Except for Father John Fate's photo slide reader, attempts to collect potential proof of an attacker were unsuccessful. As it turned out, Father John Fate was the person who heard Irene's confession on the night of her abduction. Other churchgoers that evening had observed the priest leaving the sanctuary frequently and the line for the confessional moving incredibly slowly. Many people observed the priest had significant hand scratches after the midnight mass. Investigators were informed by Father John that he frequently played with his glasses, breaking them. He explained that he had locked himself out and had to manually climb up to the second floor, which resulted in his injuries when he returned home. Noteworthy was that he heard Irene's confession in the rectory, which the priest initially denied but later admitted. Fate had already been accused of assault. If all this were not reason enough to raise some skepticism, Maria Guerra fought off an attack from a man she thought looked like a priest inside a church in Edinburgh, Texas. Fate was under intense suspicion, but church leaders kept him out of trouble by claiming there was no way a priest could have committed such a crime. The trial for this prior incident dragged on into 1962, while Irene's murder probe was proceeding, concluding with a no contest plea and a $500 fine. Taking everything into account, it is clear that Father Fate was involved in Irene's passing. Authorities were content enough for Fate to move on with his life, despite the past events. This appeared sufficient for those conducting the investigation to turn a blind eye due to his position in the priesthood and his support from the church. Fate was exiled to Assumption Abbey in Missouri by the church because of the allegations against him. The abbot asked Dale Tacheny, one of the monks, to determine whether Fate was suitable to become a monk, because the abbot was aware of Fate's alleged offenses. Fate told Tacheny about his sins, and for some reason, he was able to renounce them and become a monk. Religion is forgiving, yet it still shocks me that this could have happened. This forgiveness from the church allowed Fate to escape his prior offenses. Fate eventually grew tired of the monastery and left to work as a staff member and supervisor at a facility for wayward priests. Father James Porter, a notorious child abuser, was given the go-ahead to serve once more with other dubious priests. Many other people suffered, and Porter was ultimately imprisoned and defrocked. Fate left the priesthood in the 1970s when he started a family and became deeply interested in charitable work. The Irene Garza case faded from the headlines. By 2002, Tacheny believed the time had come to tell the authorities what he had overheard during Fate's confession years earlier. After the investigation was reopened, Father Joseph O'Brien, another priest, came forward to say that Fate had also given him a confession for the killing of Irene Garza. Around the time of the incident, O'Brien and Fate had collaborated on some projects. Renee Guerra, the district attorney for Hidalgo County, seemed uninterested in the matter. O'Brien, in his opinion, had provided unreliable testimony because of his dementia. Why would anyone be plagued by her death, he said, about the inadequate investigative work and absence of tangible evidence of the crime. She died. Her killer got away, he stated. Guerra's words suggest that he wanted the old crime swept under the rug for someone else to handle, hinting that he was unwilling to get involved with a crime over 40 years old. Unfortunately for him, this was going to be his downfall. In 2014, a young man named Ricardo Rodriguez ran for Attorney General against Guerra in the election by making the resurgence of the Irene Garza case a part of his platform. Linda LaVie, a relative of Irene Garza, describes Renee Guerra approaching her in the courthouse and telling her that she would never get an indictment in the case. Early in 2014, 48 Hours correspondent Richard Schlesinger questioned John Fate about the charges against him in front of his Arizona home. Irene Garza's murder was denied by Fate. Fate had married and had 3 children and left the clergy decades earlier. In the 2014 race for district attorney, Ricardo Rodriguez defeated Renee Guerra. Irene Garza's case was one that Rodriguez had pledged to investigate. Rodriguez kept his promise, unlike many politicians, and Fate was apprehended in the first half of 2016. Fate entered a non-guilty plea because he still believed he could escape punishment. In late 2017, 57 years after the murder of Irene Garza, John Fate stood trial for her murder. Noemi Pont Sigler recalled that her father, who was one of the first investigators to look into the Irene Garza case, was visibly concerned. She claims he was instructed to leave the situation and let his superiors handle it. He never recovered from the incident. Pont Sigler spent more than 30 years fighting for justice. Sylvia Acevedo Stern grew up next door to Irene Garza. Irene's parents were her godparents. Sylvia, who was 8 years Irene's junior, looked up to her and emulated her. Beatrice Garcia testified that Father John Fate stopped her as she was walking in 1960 and asked if he could take photos of her by the cemetery when she was dressed in all black. An off-the-record meeting between reporters and the DA in 1962 was mentioned in testimony by former reporter Daryl Davis. The DA allegedly informed Davis that they were aware Fate had killed Irene Garza and that he would be transferred to a monastery. Father Thomas Doyle, a witness with expertise in clergy abuse, testified in court about a correspondence between clergy members that the state claims are evidence of a plot between the church and the authorities. On December 7, 2017, John Bernard Fate, 85, was found guilty of the murder of Irene Garza. The following day, the jury sentenced John Fate to life. He passed away on February the 12th, 2020. It is unbelievable how Father John Fate was able to get away with his crime for so long, which makes this case fascinating. He was charged with killing Irene Garza, and there was a ton of evidence against him, yet the investigators let him easily escape their grasp. Although Rene Guerra may not have shown much interest in the case, he was unquestionably correct in stating that the early police investigation of the case was at best subpar. One can only assume that Fate's reputation as a priest first served to shield him. His confessions to other priests imply that he was forthcoming about his crime, and it is possible that others were aware of it. Perhaps the authorities chose to do nothing because of the uproar that would result if word of the priest's crime had spread. You may also blame Techany and O'Brien for remaining silent despite being aware of Fate's wrongdoing for years before his imprisonment. Allowing him to become a monk permitted Fate to hide from the public and escape any criticism directed at him. Despite the injustice, I am so happy that Irene finally received justice. Tell me what your thoughts are in the comments below, and I'll see you in the next one.